Welcome back to the Monday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen, and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. I want to remind everyone that we're actually recording this on Wednesday morning before the Thanksgiving holiday, so we'll be a little bit out of sync, but you'll be hearing it on December 2nd. We're also a little out of sync because every Wednesday we record for Thursday, and once a month, at the end of the month, we do a class called Race Class. And we started doing Race Class. The first press release, Jonathan Feingold, went out in January of 2022. And I want everyone to know that Jonathan Feingold, I believe you had written a piece at theconversation.com. I think that's where I found you. And I was like, it was an interesting conversation about DEI and CRT and all those things that were sort of swirling around in 2021. And I was like, wow, I learned a lot from this interview. I think I need to sort of bring you on a regular basis. And as a result of that, in 2022, January, we started Race Class, and now we're heading into 2025, and we need you now more than ever. We need the conversations now more than ever, because these kinds of conversations are going to be stifled in almost every setting, and that is the intent of this new administration under Donald Trump. And so I am grateful that you have said yes. And I'm grateful that you've agreed to stick with me because it's valued. So let me remind you what I wrote in that first press release. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and Arnie Arnesen are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. I want to read that last sentence again. A place where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. In describing the foundational purpose of Race Class, Feingold notes, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. Let me welcome back to the program for his beginning of his third year, practically, Professor Feingold. Thank you so much for doing this, Jonathan.
You're welcome. It's so nice to be here. Is this is the end of the third year, right?
It's the end of the, yeah, I think so.
End of the
22,
third year.
23, yeah, the beginning of the fourth year. Oh my God.
Yeah. So we're
I'm
almost
not
in
doing
year
my math
four.
well, Jonathan. I'm not doing my math well. That's right, 22, 23, and 24. So it is. It's the end of the third year.
It's all right. This is Race Class, not math class. Though we
No, but
have
I
done
just did math class, so you'll have.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a knuckle sandwich from my prior professor.
Yeah. And every once in a while we do math.
Yeah, well, we have to do math sometimes because the math will explain the racism. The math will explain the inequality. The math will explain who's been left behind. The math will explain who's been incarcerated. I mean, we have to do math because the math sometimes can be more trusted than the words.
And
So,
you know what the math also explains, Arnie?
what?
The math also explains why Democrats and universities are already folding to enabling Trump's incoming attack on all of us. The math.
We're self-censoring. We're acting in fear.
Yeah, whether you think about the math sort of with respect to Democratic politicians as donor-driven, or with respect to universities as the outsized power that boards of trustees have over institutional governance, boards of trustees who tend to come from the corporate side, the education side. So yeah, it's all math. So I guess, it's math class today.
It is math class today, but totally appropriate. So, but Jonathan, as you were talking about it in that sort of anticipation of what's happening, it's not just Democrats and universities, it's the LA Times and the Washington Post and all those people that are already self-censoring. And you kind of see it in how Donald Trump is approaching, for example, his threat to Canada and Mexico of the 25% tariff and the 10% tariff on all goods coming in from China. Whether he actually follows through or not, he's already created a chill. He's already created a reaction. So it's not even, it's the threat is successful, not even the follow through. Why? Because we respond to the threat. And that's exactly what he wants us to do, because then he gets the best of both worlds. You stop your behavior, and he's successful without even having to put it in writing. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So you wrote a piece, and the piece was entitled, Could Florida Colleges Be the Blueprint for Trump's War on Education? The Florida GOP weaponized racism and anti-Semitism to reshape academic institutions. Recent trends suggest liberal universities could cave to the pressure. And what I find fascinating is that we've been covering this with Ron DeSantis, especially because we've been covering New College. And the story of New College is such a tragedy on every level, Jonathan, that I think we need to sort of refresh everyone's recollection of why, in some ways, it has become the poster child for exactly not only what Ron DeSantis wants to do with his threats of controlling higher education, but ultimately what Donald Trump and his administration will want to do as well, will all be New College if they are successful. So can you remind my audience what happened with Ron DeSantis and New College and why this is really an apocryphal tale?
Yeah, and I will. To do so, I'm going to take a half step back.
Mhm.
And because I think it's important to try to think about the relationship between universities and authoritarians. And in 2021, when the U.S. had pulled out of Afghanistan, Ron Daniels, who was the president of Johns Hopkins, the scholar on authoritarianism, he wrote a nice little op-ed in the Washington Post that was explaining why one of the Taliban's first targets was um, uh, one of the only, if not the only, independent university in Afghanistan. And one thing that he said, which I think is a pretty modest observation, is that independent universities are inimical to, I'm paraphrasing now, uh, the authoritarians' lust for power, in part because independent universities are driven by, at least, um, uh, generally driven by the pursuit of truth and knowledge for the common good, not for some corporate interest, partisan gain, or entrenchment of authoritarian power. And he linked the Taliban there to Mussolini's Mussolini's reign to, and just global authoritarian movements, including Viktor Orban in Hungary. And he identified how Viktor Orban, who now we know is deeply enmeshed with right wing authoritarian movements in the United States, including the incoming president. Trump hosted Orban at Mar-a-Lago earlier this year. Heritage Foundation hosted Orban. Tucker Carlson spent time in Hungary learning from Viktor Orban. It is a glow in the same way the summer of not the same way, but in ways that sort of there's parallels to how in the summer of 2020 there was a global uprising for racial justice. There's also global right-wing authoritarian movements who learn from each other. And one thing that Orban had done quite successfully that Ron Daniels named in the piece was he led a vicious smear campaign against one of Hungary's most important universities that forced it to relocate um, to Austria.
Oh my God.
And so something that the Daniels piece, I think, and I've always, or I've long encouraged, folks from inside the United States not to, fall into this trap of thinking like all that stuff happens out there. Because what DeSantis has quite systematically been able to accomplish over the past 4 or so years in Florida tracks with halting, precision what folks like Orban and the Taliban have done in under regimes that we just intuitively know, like obviously that's not democracy. Maybe we fight over precisely what it is, but there's no sort of self-democratic rule there. This is strong men who are imposing their will in part by defanging institutions that would otherwise check authoritarian power, like independent universities,
Wow.
which is one reason. So yeah, jump in.
No, no. I'm so glad you went to where you went at the beginning of this conversation because I have to grab this person who wrote a piece at the conversation November 1st. Listen to the title of it. How the Taliban is seeking to reshape Afghanistan's schools, not higher ed, to push their ideology. There we go. So you're talking about what was written about the university system that was written right after we pulled out of Afghanistan. I am now telling you that I'm looking at this headline and I'm thinking about, getting rid of the Department of Education, looking at what they're doing about how they're reshaping, bringing the Bible into Oklahoma schools, the Trump Bible, all these things. And what is it? As I could just change the word, how the Trump administration are seeking to reshape America's schools to push their ideology. Same headline, only it's not Afghanistan and the Taliban, it's Donald Trump and its ideology and education. So again, it's a continuation of exactly what you were just saying. I had seen this article and I'm like, oh my God, they're meshing together.
Yeah. So so I think that's exactly right. Um and it just places into sharp relief that there's multiple reasons why Trump, Heritage Foundation, Linda McMahon, who likely will become the Secretary of Education, folks like Chris Rufo, folks like Oklahoma's superintendent, who is doing all sorts of pretty nuts stuff that is very overtly seeking to um, uh, infuse within public education in the state an overtly sort of uh, particular sort of Christian ideology.
Hmm.
Uh, and part of it is because schools are where we all get inculcated into cultural values. It's where sort of our basic understanding of the world works. And it helps reveal that one of the, so there was a, common headline in 2021 when folks like Rufo, DeSantis, Trump were engaged in these rhetorical attacks on critical race theory. The headline was CRT is a boogeyman. We don't actually teach it in school. And in certain respects, that was right. But in other respects, it misunderstood one of the reasons why folks like Rufo, and I think a way that is he doesn't get credit for, he appreciated that the unapologetic smear campaign targeting CRT wasn't just about riling up a base against the backdrop of movements for Black lives. It was also that CRT and the ideas that are incubated in those sorts of spaces travel and are a threat if you are committed to an anti-democratic vision of society. If you're committed to maintaining the sorts of hierarchies and inequalities that are pervasive, that are both racial, but not just racial, which is another way of saying that CRT wasn't just a boogeyman, it was a threat. Because if you expose students to just the basic sorts of concepts that help them problematize inequality, the status quo, as not just something that is natural, that just sort of flows out of these neutral markets, but are the product of both historical and contemporary arrangements that enable a very tiny minority of the country to control everything in ways that both entrenches all sorts of racial hierarchy, but also just means that most people in the United States who we'd racialize as white live incredibly precarious lives. If people get access to that stuff, then they want to overthrow, the prevailing order. And so for folks like Rufo, you've got to both discredit and outlaw that basic knowledge because that knowledge often is a prerequisite to the sorts of democratic shifts that is necessary to just realizing a country that is better positioned to prioritize the dignity of people over profits.
But you have to outlaw that knowledge because if you have that knowledge, then they can't blame them. because you know that that's, I mean, it's all about taking your hate and your anger and your frustration and pointing it in a certain direction. And you can point it in a certain direction if there's a vacuum of knowledge. If you don't understand it and you sort of see, and they are the other, okay, whatever the other is, they have speak a different language or they're a different color. And then you have some authoritarian saying that's their fault, kind of like what Hitler did with the Jews, you know? And if you don't know any better, well, then it's their fault. But if you begin to teach things like DEI, you bring in DEI, you have CRT, you understand racism, you talk about the history, Black American history, Native American history. All of a sudden now you're getting all this new information, and then all of a sudden they don't become the other, Jonathan. They become your neighbor. They become someone in your community. You can't otherize someone that you know in that way. But if you don't know them because you've never been taught, then it's easy to hate them because what do you know of them?
Right. And and another way to think about why analytical tools that helps students diagnose the sources of precarity in the United States, why that is a threat to folks like Rufo or the Heritage Foundation or the Koch brothers, is because then the sorts of fear mongering that authoritarians rely on in order to entrench power is just less effective
Yeah.
because the knowledge is in a sense functions as a prophylactic against the sort of divide and conquer politics that we've seen since sort of 20 like mid 20th century fascist movements to today, because it becomes very clear that, oh, the reason why my like rent is so high and like the cost of everything is so high and my paycheck is so low and my boss can fire me on a whim isn't because you've got other folks in, around the world who are just trying to survive and immigrating to the United States to work even more like precarious sorts of jobs. They're not the reason why uh, I live this deeply distressed life. It's because over the past 40 years, the powers that be, in a like often bipartisan way, have increasingly shifted power towards, the elite few. Um, but so I want to, we're almost out of time because we've just sort of been chatting. I want to think a
No.
little bit more, um, with a little bit more precision about the university's relationship to authoritarians and Trump. So one thing that Ron Daniels says, as we started with, is that authoritarians are threatened by independent universities because independent universities can check their power. I think that's an incomplete story that only captures part of Trump's relationship with higher ed, the part that we understand in the way that he vilifies universities as, like, through rhetoric like woke indoctrination. Universities also offer a really potent ally for authoritarian regimes. If the authoritarians can capture universities in the ways like DeSantis did and turn them into an arm of the state, or even when there's separation, if universities start doing things that end up um, even indirectly legitimizing the moves the authoritarian wants to make in order to entrench power. And so, New College, you bring up New College. New College was this really incredible bastion of uh, creativity, knowledge, open inquiry in Florida, a sort of renowned public liberal arts institution that DeSantis, Rufo, and other right-wing ideologues were able to take over, in part because the goal is to make New College an arm of the state, so that it is not promoting its public mission to engage in the pursuit of truth and knowledge for the common good, but actually to, there's a lot of grift, and we know that it's also grift. It's not just ideological um, uh, moves, but to create sites of knowledge production that promote DeSantis's partisan political interests. And you see that at places like New College, but you also see it at places like George Mason University, where over a recent period, um, there's been essentially a Koch-led infusion of money that has then enabled Koch and Koch sort of allied groups to dictate hiring and priorities at George Mason.
Yeah,
You
George Mason.
also see in Florida the creation of essentially think tanks within universities that are designed to essentially use public tax dollars to fund knowledge production that, again, is not about pursuing truth and knowledge for the common good, but is about pursuing, or engaging in knowledge production to um, support far narrower partisan or corporate interests. And so this is a way in which you can essentially recruit the university and the infrastructure there, not to engage in open inquiry, but actually to engage in very targeted pursuits that are actually antithetical to democratic aims. But then you have something else that's going on as well. And this is something that we saw over the past year, and the sort of thing that Democratic leaders like Chuck Schumer are also complicit in.
Oh,
So for the past year, as probably all listeners are aware, there's been a rise of protests advocating for Palestinian human rights, oftentimes in university campuses. And one of the um, rhetorical moves that has been employed in order to discredit these protests that you can trace to Chris Rufo, among others, and I sort of cite to this in the piece that you referenced at the outset, is to reframe or to cast pro-Palestinian advocacy as presumptively anti-Semitic, in part because that just scrambles everyone's ability to sort of clearly understand or cleanly sort of understand like the moral clarity of the student's position, even if it exists against the backdrop of a somewhat sort of complex sort of geopolitical context, sort of past and present. And the move to discredit as presumptively anti-Semitic pro-Palestinian advocacy is what I think of as sort of a sort of Trojan horse for the most anti-democratic organizations and movements in the United States to go after their opponents that just are like our basic sort of civil society organizations and nonprofits. And so the way that you sort of see this link is through stuff like Project Esther. Have you talked about Project Esther on your
we've
show?
never talked about. I was really tell my audience real quickly. We only have a few minutes left. What is Project Esther? That was the first time I'd ever heard of it.
So Project Esther is another initiative out of the Heritage Foundation. It was publicly released, I believe, on October 7th, 2024, this year. So on the 1 year
It's
anniversary of
new. Okay.
Hamas's attacks
Yeah.
on Israel. And what it essentially calls for is, or what it does, is it labels or it locates pro-Palestinian advocacy under what it terms the Hamas support network. So it makes this very um, uh, intentional move of describing as them like terrorists organizations that engage in pro-Palestinian advocacy by making the claim that those organizations, whether it's Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, or others, why they're not just, according to Project Esther, engaged in, calls for ceasefire. They're actually supporting terrorist designated organizations. Now you might ask, well, who drafted Project Esther? It turns out it's sort of its prominent authors are from some of the most prominent Christian Zionist organizations in the United States. And so it's not actually sort of, I think even like folks like the ADL have tried to distance themselves from it. But the move is to label as a terrorist supporting organization any entity that vocally communicates support for Palestinian human rights. And then to parlay that into any entity that may, one way or another, be supportive of the entity that engages in pro-Palestinian advocacy. and some of the civil society organizations that Project Esther formally sort of accuses or calls out as being part of the quote unquote Hamas support network is the Open Societies Foundation, which is, George Soros's
Yeah.
huge pro-democracy human rights foundation. And the move, part of the sort of key logical leap is to label as quote unquote supporting Hamas or supporting a terrorist organization advocacy that is either pro-Palestinian or critical of the state of Israel.
Right.
And so then when you see folks like Chuck Schumer or other Democrats supporting legislation that makes a similar move, or when you see universities treating their students as, presumptively, anti or
Well,
you,
they're also
it
conflating it with anti-Semitism. So you can't criticize Israel, because if you're criticizing Israel, you're criticizing Jews. And if you're criticizing Jews, you must be anti-Semitic. And again, I'm going to end with this statement. Israel is a state, not a synagogue. Israel is a state, not a synagogue. And I just want to remind everyone, if we can't criticize Netanyahu, how are we going to be able to criticize Donald Trump? It's also part of a continuum. Let me thank Jonathan Feingold, who is a professor at Boston University Law School. We've been teaching now for 3 years race class. We've been talking about his article, Could Florida's Colleges Be the Blueprint for Trump's War on Education? I'll make sure I post it on my Facebook page. The Florida GOP weaponized racism and anti-Semitism to reshape academic institutions. Recent trends suggest liberal universities could cave to the pressure. Thank you so much and have a great holiday.
Thanks, Arnie.
You're welcome.